Good morning, afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second Tech Talk series of 2022. I'm Matt Keys, the Global Technical Authority for Offshore Structures at Kent, which was formerly the Atkins Oil and Gas. At Kent, we have an offshore structures team of 300 engineers across the UK and Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, and APAC. And we specialise in the areas of ageing assets, decommissioning, and now into offshore wind. We have experience with probably 60 to 70% of the world's offshore structural assets. Today's talk is slightly different. Joining me will be a panel of experts from our team around the globe who will provide insight on the topic today. We have Eric Ho, our APAC team lead for offshore structures, and Mohamed Atia, our team lead from the Middle East. We also have Neil Cuthbert here, who's our decommissioning subject matter expert who is based in the UK. The session today will focus on an update of our RISQ in a Storm JIP and how that has been used for ageing assets to decommissioning across the regions. So just to start, the key bit being the energy challenge, and we're all well aware of this. And what we have here is two offshore structures that we typically deal with. The one on the left is a wellhead platform, and these are at relative scales to each other. They're both in around 50 metres of water. And the one on the right is a recently installed, a couple of years back now, a new offshore wind turbine. So the wellhead platform on the left generates just over 8,500 megawatt hours of storable energy per day. And that's a traditional energy source we've all been used to and creates a very cheap level of power or cheap cost of power that and energy which we've all been used to. The new technologies which we all agree we need to transition to help with things like global warming and other effects is the renewable source. But the challenge that we have, and you can see here with the amount of steel difference between the two structures, is there's slightly more cost in these structures, but also the amount of energy they generate. So this is an 8 megawatt turbine generating only 62 megawatts of non-storable energy per day. And if this is converted to hydrogen and then back to energy, it's under 20 megawatt hours of storable energy per day. So it's a significant amount less than what the traditional one is. And that cost balance is something that we're fighting with and something that we're working on optimizing. And so this is improving every day and every year, and it's probably about twice as good as these numbers suggest in today's numbers in the concepts that are going in. But we're not short of that. And the energy challenge we have is keeping these existing oil and gas assets going, operating them safely and cost effectively into the future and decommissioning them safely as well as we transition our energy source from our traditional area onto the offshore wind and other renewable spaces. So today, what you'll learn in today's talk is really you'll get a refresher on the storm risk to offshore structures. And so we'll get Eric to give an update on the RISQ in a Storm JIP and where that's at the moment, and obviously how that applies to evacuation procedures globally. Then we'll have Mohamed will give an update on the applicability in the Middle East with an example there and really around shut-in procedures that can be impacted. And Neil will then give an update on the applicability to decommissioning of the RISQ in a Storm methodologies and tools that we've got developed. So I'll now pass you over to Eric to kick this off.
Thanks, Matt. So firstly, a refresher for the concept of RISQ in a storm and why we need it. And we firstly illustrate this by examining some hindcast mid-ocean data for a particular location. And in this case, it's the Browse Basin in north of Australia. We've got 40 years of storms here plotted, firstly as a significant wave height on the vertical against its year of occurrence along the bottom. And in a similar chart, we show the wind speed in each storm. These storms are colored by the maximum storm category. And the small writing that you see on each bar are the names of the tropical cyclones. So when we design structures, we design them to be obviously code compliant. And what this actually means is that the annual probability of exceeding the design capacity is less than a target threshold. For structures with people on board, this threshold is typically around 10 to the minus 4. But we have to understand that this annual probability of failure is averaged out over the entire 40 years. Now, the probability of failure during an actual storm can be quite a bit higher. And this is plotted here for a hypothetical structure in this region that is code compliant. And what this shows us is that while the annual probability of failure is okay and design compliant, the event probability is possibly intolerable, particularly during intense storms. Now, saying this again, structures that are code compliant can still be subjected to intolerable risk when a storm is forecast. So in this case, there are 5 occasions where the event risk exceeds 10 to the minus 3. Now, 10 to the minus 3 is a threshold I've drawn in here. And we've seen this threshold adopted for event risk by several operators. So by extension, leaving staff on board during these 5 occasions is not allowed. But many structures are actually not permanently staffed, and operators have a storm evacuation philosophy. Most of these philosophies are based on prescriptive criteria like storm category and storm proximity. In this example here, we can see that a philosophy based on category 3 results in 8 occasions of destaffing. And we see here that this is possibly more than what is necessary during the life of the facility. So for most of these category-based evacuation occasions, we can see that they correspond with times where the event risk is actually quite high. So that's a good thing. However, we can see at least one occasion where the event risk is high, but the category approach doesn't require any evacuation. Cyclone Vincent, the wind speeds make it category 1, however, the wave heights make it high risk. So many people should understand that storm categories are based on wind speed only, and if your structure is governed by waves, a storm category evacuation approach may not be appropriate. So reiterating this, category or proximity-based evacuation philosophy can be potentially unduly conservative, but more concerning is that it can miss high-risk occasions. So hopefully this example illustrates the need for the risk in a storm approach. We should understand that our risk levels in a storm better to inform evacuation decisions. So our work in the risk in a storm approach has now reached a stage where we need wider industry collaboration to take it further. This roadmap gives a high-level summary of the continued development of the risk in a storm approach as a JIP. Since around 2019, for many facilities, we have been helping operators manage risk to personnel during storms by evacuating them when a storm is forecast, rather than strengthening the platform and leaving them on board. Now, of course, a key part of making this approach work is the forecast. And last year, we kicked off discussions with both regional and global weather forecasters. And basically, that was to identify partners that could implement the latest forecast methods in any region. We also started the development of an online web portal, which can reliably deliver the forecast risk results from any weather forecaster and for any facility in any format they require. Now, the other big item for the risk in a storm approach is how to appropriately deal with forecast uncertainty. And through the second half of last year, we have developed a methodology to account for this. And we are currently trialing this in the Australian region. Part of the JIP plan is to also trial that in other regions, identify improvements and look at some alternatives. So the JIP takes this strong foundation and now aims to build upon it with wider operator feedback from this year onwards. And we think that the JIP will be a good vehicle for developing a common approach to managing storm risk and bringing a wider industry consensus to engage the offshore regulators in each region. So the methods developed will be tested in other regions, and through collection of results and continuous data collection and feedback, we'll improve the method even further. So our latest developments for this approach are summarized at a high level here. Firstly, we take advantage of our history and past work, we have been, as Matt said, involved in many of the world's offshore platforms, in fact, somewhere between 60 and 70%. And for many of these, we have models for both fixed and floating structures. And many of these are aging facilities, so we have gone often beyond code compliance to focus on structural reliability and risk. We also take advantage of our work in integrity management and inspection planning, and we can incorporate the fatigue risk and also the change in fatigue risk after an inspection via the POD, or probability of detection. And most recently, we have established methods to bring all of this together into a probabilistic response surface. Our latest efforts, these are multi-dimensional, and they're designed to rapidly predict a response to a large number of possible environmental conditions in a matter of seconds. Now, this is relevant and really necessary because the most suitable forecast guidance to use for quantitative risk predictions are ensemble forecasts. So each ensemble member will give a time history of environmental conditions over the next 7 to 10 days. And if we consider all points in time for each ensemble member, then that leads to thousands of conditions that we need the response for pretty much upon receiving the forecast. In Australia, BOM have Bureau of Meteorology, BOM, have developed bias correction methods to improve the skill of the forecast. And this is particularly for intense tropical cyclones. This was previously presented in our Tech Talks last year. However, even with this improvement in forecast skill, we still need to consider the possibility that there exists a storm track, not amongst the ensemble tracks, that could lead to a higher response. And this is where the consideration of the forecast uncertainty comes in. And in our current method being trialed, we use a response-based approach to account for this uncertainty. So bringing the forecast and the response together to determine the risk comes under our AKIMA umbrella, which stands for Quantitative Integrity Management Approach, while RISQ is our Risk in a Storm quantifier module of the AKIMA suite. So far, the AKIMA Risk Service has delivered live risk outcomes via lookup tables or charts where we plot the outcome of the risk calculation in a green or a red zone. We've also delivered cumulative risk charts for finite window operations. Essentially, these are all bespoke to specific operator requirements. But we've now brought this into a more modern web portal system for improved reliability, access, and more interactive features. So that concludes the update for the Risk in a Storm approach and the corresponding JIP. And we're keen to see this applied to more than evacuation. So I'll hand back to Matt to hear more about that.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for that recap on where we are with the current JRP. And so now to give a different perspective on where this can be used and how it applies to the Middle East, I'll hand over to Mohamed to talk through an example there. Over to you, Mohamed.
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Matt. So what we'll look at here is how AKIMA RISQ tool can be applied in the Middle East and lead to considerable sort of savings. The Metocean criteria in the Middle East, similar to other regions, have increased over the past few years. And if we have a look at the chart, which represents the HS values, or the significant wave height values from 1980s up till around 2015, the red dots represent the yearly maximum values, and what we can see is that they tend to go up and higher, more towards the past few years. And if you've managed to update as an operator, if you managed to update your Metocean criteria recently, you'll observe that there had been storms in the region post 2015, which have even a higher HS value for about 4 meters. Now, what we also noticed is that not all sort of Metocean studies have covered durations prior to the 1980s. And this has been released just recently in the public domain, and what you'll see there is from the 1950s until the 1980s, there had been quite a few storms with HS values that are even higher than what we've seen from the 1980s onwards. What that would essentially mean is that the criteria used for designing assets, is not applicable anymore and have increased. And this would then, if you conduct any sort of analysis now, there is a higher chance of getting non-compliance due to that. Also, over the past couple of years, we've managed to do a number of reliability analysis, mainly on most of the assets in the UAE. And what we observed is that the fragility curve in general, on an average, is higher than that of the North Sea and what's implicit in the API. And although we can use the response-based metocean analysis, which provided considerable improvement on the hazard values, you're likely to still have some of the assets sort of non-complying. So there, as an example, the hazard curves or fragility curve on the left, the difference between them, if you account for the uncertainty of failure, the critical value that we look at is what's the ratio between the 10,000 year response magnitude compared to the 100-year, and also can be used as the RSR values. And on the right, we have the histogram of the target RSR values and against the number of assets. So essentially, what will happen is that you'll find that a number of the assets have a higher target capacity to reach, and at the same time we have the increased metocean criteria. So looking at all of that, that would require strengthening to a good number of assets there, and another option or another route rather than strengthening is to consider the current behavior or the knowledge that we have on the assets and their performance, along with the forecasts that would come with their uncertainty. And both of these sort of can be linked and evaluated by the Akima RISQ tool to provide operators with the expected or the forecasted risk over the next upcoming event or period, and depends on your target for the asset, whether it's life safety or shut-in criteria. You'll get notifications either for evacuations or for implementing a shut-in, and in that case, you've addressed both risk requirements with operational procedures instead of considerable strengthening costs. I think that concludes my part, and I'll hand over back to you, Matt. Thanks.
Thanks, Mohamed. Thanks for that insight there into the Middle East application. And so lastly, we'll hand over now to Neil Cuthbert, who will give us an understanding of how it can be applied for decommissioning activities. Over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Matt. So decommissioning is a relatively new area with a significant ramp up in activity expected in the coming decade. To a certain extent, the codes and standards used are still developing. Typically, DNV codes, such as those shown on the screen, are used, which address fixed and floating structures. These codes are calibrated to achieve a 1 × 10⁻⁴ risk level per operation. Each code uses a slightly different recipe or approach to achieve the target risk level. For example, using a most probable maximum load combined with a higher environmental load factor, or a 10% exceedance value on the load side with a lower environmental load factor. In decommissioning, the tolerable risk can be higher than in normal operating mode due to the removal of life safety risk. There can, however, be a tendency to cherry pick different aspects of each method, which can lead to much higher risk levels that would be ordinarily tolerable in the industry. For example, combining the MPM load with a load factor of 1.15 for reduced life safety risk with a load ratio power of 2 can result in a 1 in 10 risk level. Similarly, where a code is applied to a situation that's not wholly appropriate, the risk level can be orders of magnitude higher. Where we see this the most is related to the application of inertia calibrated codes to fix jacket structures for decommissioning operations such as jacket cutting. So where does the Akima RISQ tool come into play? Well, it's similar in many ways to how Eric and Mohamed described earlier, with a slightly different focus. The tool can receive information from structural integrity management of the structure. However, this would look to include load and capacity variability for different phases of the decommissioning program. For example, a jacket structure with reduced capacity due to leg cutting. In-service inspection and fatigue data can also be added. Then the weather forecast ensemble data can be added, as Eric described, for the period of interest in the operation being considered. The Schema risk tool then generates an output which can quantify the risk of the operation being considered. This can be compared against typical in-service risk levels and a tolerable risk level set to provide assurance to operations in the field. Essentially, knowing and establishing the risk level of the decommissioning operation is a powerful addition to the toolbox. That's me finished, and I'll now hand back to Matt. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Neil. So yeah, so in conclusion there, so the key bits that we've talked about today is, so before or previously, we've always managed things using an annual target probability of failure. But really now what's changed is we have a lot more data available, so increased measured data, but the key bit being it's the improved forecast ability is the really key thing. So the ensemble models that Eric touched on previously has given us a much better visibility of what forecast storms are likely to be like for the location of the assets we have. So now using that in combination with the more advanced response models, it can be used for applications as we talked about today. So emergency response, and linking your integrity with emergency response, decommissioning activities like Neil touched on, shut-in activities like Mohamed touched on, or any weather-affected maintenance or any weather-affected operations. So thanks for listening in today, and thanks for listening to the recording. If you do have any questions, you'll see now that our contact details are up on the presentation at the moment. Feel free to drop us an email and we're happy to get back to you and talk through further on any one of these areas or topics. Thanks very much.